Hello, I'm Rob Byrne, president of the San Francisco Film Reserve, and welcome to Online on SFFP, our monthly series of presentations and discussions related to all things film. The San Francisco Film Reserve is a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco. Our mission is to restore, preserve, and provide access to our shared cinematic heritage. And speaking of access, and not to mention good fun, if you're going to be in the San Francisco Bay Area this month, don't miss the world premiere of two of our newest restorations, Black Lightning, 1926, starring Clara Bow in one of her earliest roles and featuring Thunder the Marvel Dog. And preceding the feature will be the short adventure, The Love Fighter from 1926, starring a different animal star, this time Fearless the Wonder Dog. Both films will be accompanied live by the incomparable Wayne Barker and introduced by writer, historian, and author David Sten. All this happens Tuesday, August 26th at the epicenter of San Francisco cinema, the Roxy Theater. You can grab tickets at roxy.com or by clicking through the event section of our own website, filmpreserve.org. But first, we're delighted to be joined today by our dear friend, Pamela Hutchinson. Pamela is a freelance film critic and author of books such as BFI Film Classics, On the Red Shoes, and Pandora's Box. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Empire, and Criterion Collection. She's a columnist for Sight and Sound and edits Weekly Film Bulletin. Her curation projects include seasons on Marlene Dietrich and Asta Nielsen for the BFI Southbank, and she indulges her obsession with silent cinema at silentlondon.co.uk. Pamela will be presenting C.A. Lejeune and Britain's Lady Film Critics, a topic I'm very much looking forward to learning more about. Following the presentation, we'll have a little time for questions and comments, so please pop them into the chat or in the question section, and we'll get to them at the end. And so, without further ado, please welcome to your Zoom screen, Pamela Hutchinson.
Hello, Rob. Thank you so much for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me, see me. I'm coming to you from England, and I'm sounding very English after that. I really need to start sharing my presentation. I'm going to be talking to you today about a woman I've been researching for quite a long time, my favourite film critic, Caroline Alice Lejeune. If I can start this. Great. So Caroline Lejeune, who you can see in the picture there, was known professionally as C.A. Lejeune, and she was a pioneering British newspaper film critic. And she began writing about the cinema in the silent era in 1921 for the Manchester Guardian, which is now the Guardian, and international viewers will know it from its New York and California and Australia offices as well. She became their official film critic in 1922, and then in 1928 she moved to The Observer, which later also became The Guardian's sister paper. It's a Sunday newspaper. And she stayed there until the very end of 1960 when she resigned, or she was sacked. We're not sure which. When I was first writing my silent film website, Silent London, I was working for The Guardian and therefore also The Observer. So in that archive, which I was looking at a lot, and other archives, I found myself regularly reading C.A. Lejeune's wonderful reviews and enjoying her sharp eye for cinematic technique, her elegant phrasing, her always very clear language, sensitivity to the emotional impact of cinema, her belief in the audience, especially the working class and female audience, her progressive views, and her marvellous jokes. And yet, there seemed to be a problem. Looking up potted histories of Lejeune, I found a story about a snobbish, middle-class woman who didn't believe in cinema as an art form, who preferred gardening, detective novels, and opera, who achieved her position only through nepotism and ended her career very much on the wrong side of film history by storming out of screenings of boundary-pushing masterpieces. The famous examples are Michael Powell's Peeping Tom and Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, unable to see the artistry there. And as to whether she was the first newspaper film critic in the UK, that seems an impossible question to answer, but probably no, and certainly not the first female film critic either. And added to that, if you weren't discouraged enough, She was not as good as Dilys Powell, they said. Dilys Powell was her counterpart on the Sunday Times. They overlapped their careers for 2 decades, in which they were the twin doyens of film criticism in the UK, the Sunday ladies. But Powell had the stronger stomach and the longer career. She continued reviewing films until the 1990s. She did not prefer gardening. Now, we're not about to stage some kind of fight between two writers. I love Dilys Powell's writing too, and it's very important to this story. But I want to talk about how I had faith in Caroline, and I proved to myself that there was more to her story than that. I like an unfashionable cause, and so did Caroline. She famously wrote, when she was reviewing the wonderful Stella Dallas, about sentiment in cinema. Sentiment is the warmth that keeps us happy, the response that brings us friends. So I knew that my affection for Caroline's writing would lead me to an interesting story. All right, I had faith at least. I started to do some research, and the research could never end. This is a gargantuan project. There are 2 anthologies of Lejeune's criticism, a posthumous collection edited by her son Anthony Lejeune, and one she curated herself in 1947. That's called Chestnuts in Her Lap. And as much as possible, though, I wanted to read her columns as they appeared in newsprint in context, because criticism is a conversation, and the letters that were sent to her personally, the letters that appeared on the letters page, the responses in other spheres, including other magazines, that's all part of the story to me. I also looked in various archives where I could find some of her correspondence, and together with all these sources, her own personal archive is in Manchester University, where she studied. I was able to build up a bit of a picture of her working life, her career, her relationships with her editors, just the life of a working film journalist. And all this came on top of her very sweet memoir, Thank You for Having Me, which she published in 1971. So what have I learned? I've learned an awful lot about C.A. Lejeune, a film critic that I was told not to care about. But what I really discovered was a full history. I've pretty much got the full story of C.A. Lejeune. I'm almost there. And a bit of a love story between Caroline and the cinema. So I wanted to share with you a bit of that. And we're going to start with some of the history, because it's interesting to see how a pioneer in film criticism may get to that point. Caroline decided to become a film critic the summer after she graduated from Manchester University with a very, very strong degree. She was watching The Mark of Zorro, starring Douglas Fairbanks, at a cinema in Brighton, and it came to her that she could become a film critic and combine her passions for writing and cinema. And so she approached the editor of the Manchester Guardian, where she'd already placed a few articles. And he was a very close friend of her mother's, it's true, but he wasn't very keen on the idea of a film critic. So he shunted her down to the London office, where she sort of took on any assignment that she was given, reviewing fashion shows and things like that. By October of that year, she was able to place a piece in the Manchester Guardian on the back page where they allowed a kind of arts opinion piece. And she called this piece The Undiscovered Aesthetic. And it was a campaign for film criticism. In this quote, the bottom, she said, "The kinema has done bravely without the critics, but now the time for collaboration has come. An aesthetic must be found, potentiality must be recognised, must be estimated, and true genius recognised." This is the public face of her campaign to become a film critic. Because all the film criticism she was writing was anonymous as part of the newspaper's London coverage. This is a Manchester paper with a London office. So here's a review that's definitely by her of General John Regan, and you can tell it's by her instead of one of their other dramatic critics who's moonlighting in cinema, because she has a line here. At such moments, the screen and the screen alone is a perfect medium of expression. And believe me, no one else would say that at the time. Privately, she was fighting the battle much more strongly. She writes a letter here to the editor of The Guardian, Mr. Scott, C.P. Scott. It begins, "Mother tells me that you would like a few more particulars about the cinema and why I consider that there is a need for trade show notices." It's 8 pages, this letter, and she explains exactly why film criticism should be done from the trade shows, to release reviews before the films are released to the public, that you have to know which trade shows to attend, you need to know about all the international film industries, you need to care about cinema, know the terminology, and that she is the perfect woman to do this. And by the way, also, she says, "You should get me while I'm cheap." And so he must have agreed because by the beginning of the next year, she has a column. In her memoir, she acts like this is a surprise, but I think that's a little coy. Very first week of the new year, she has a column, and she has a format for this column. I don't expect you to read it, I just want you to see the size of it, which she stuck to throughout her entire career. In her column, she'll try and talk about an issue that faces the cinema that week, and she will talk about three or four, two or three different films. Normally, one that she considers the lead, and two that she just wants to dismiss and maybe have a little bit of fun with. So here she's talking about the star system, which she doesn't like, and she reviews a film starring Bibi Daniels called Ducks and Drakes, and also a Marion Davies comedy, Marion Davies film called Buried Treasure. But what she really wants to talk about is the Swedish film The Phantom Carriage, which she says nothing so fine has yet been shown in England, and besides work of this kind, other pictures seem crude and commonplace. She knows what she's talking about. She'd switch this in the future, and she'd normally lead with the film that she cared about the most. She'd put that at the front. You'll see she has a byline, CAL, definitely modelled on other people's bylines, and also how she'd been signing her own letters for years. She more or less falls straight away in how she wants to be a film critic, but I've got a tiny little case study to give you a sense of how she defined and differentiated her work from other writers on film, because there were lots of people reviewing films, just not the same way that she did it. This film from the Ideal Studio, Diana of the Crossways, is an adaptation of a popular 19th century novel by George Meredith. Full confession, I've tried to read this novel. I find it really difficult. I will one day persevere, but it's a beloved novel at the time, and this was a prestige release. The marketing for the film involved inviting film journalists from the fan magazines and trade magazines down to the set, emphasizing that this was wholesome and highbrow entertainment, beautiful coloured images like this one of Faye Compton, and that's not Thunder the Marvel dog, I'm afraid. These are English dogs. And the idea was that people should be pretty impressed by the fact that they were making this film at all. But C.A. Lejeune wasn't so easily impressed. This clip is from a letter to her mother. Her mother was still up in Manchester at the time, and she points out in this letter that she's been making friends with critics at the trade shows. One in particular, a music critic who's more than 30 years older than her, E.A. Bourne. She's very impressed by him, but she's argued with him about Diana of the Crossways. She said he is of the Meredith generation and was boiling with rage. It's the same old story. The people who like the novel aren't going to like the film. And when the film reviews came out, E.A. Bourne was in the majority of criticising the film because it wasn't as good as the novel. And you'll see here in his headline, not according to Meredith. He thinks it's not as good as the book. And he says that the problems with it are generally the problems that are just inherent to the cinema and how inadequate it is. He says men and women on the screen are always primitive, violent creatures. Now, C.A. Lejeune isn't having this at all. Her review's different to everyone else's. She realizes that the people who are reading her reviews are cinema goers. They're not choosing between watching this new film adaptation and reading an old book. They're choosing between watching this new British film and watching the new Mary Pickford film that's coming out in the cinemas the same weekend. So, with all due apologies to the memory of George Meredith, I am bringing Diana Merion into court this week, face to face with little Lord Fauntleroy, and treating them with respect as equals. She even goes as far as to say that now sort of commonplace thing about how bad books often make the better films and there's no need to be respectful. But one of the most interesting criticisms she has regarding the film is that she's got no interest in the novelist's son's endorsement. She says he doesn't know what he's talking about. She says that he is, by praising this film, he is underrating the power of the cinema in general and the quality of ideal films. That's the studio in particular. She lists the films he must not have seen. He must not have seen Shirley. He must not have seen Wuthering Heights. So she's already differentiating herself from the trade critics who talk to the industry and from the critics on most of the rest of the newspapers who consider film to be a branch or dilution of other arts. And so the only interest in this film would be if you like the novel and you want to compare it to that. this point, she's pretty much set out her stall as someone who takes cinema more seriously than other people. And as we'll see, lots of other people will join her in this. And she's really kind of invented the idea of what we think of as a newspaper film critic now, talking to the readers who are cinema goers, loving cinema, but being smart enough to have your opinions printed in newsprint. I want to talk a little bit about Caroline Lejeune's love story, as that is her love story with film, because she was very passionate about cinema. Of course, she was. But one of the things that people often say about her to denigrate her work is to say that she didn't care about film. And, that may be true, but I felt that the story had to be a little bit more complicated than that. So as a young girl, she fell in love with writing first, stories and poems. She fell in love with the lyrics of Gilbert and Sullivan, way before she fell in love with the cinema. And she invented this job of press film critic for herself, and she got to the very top of her profession before she was ultimately let down by the medium that was her subject. She discovered that cinema had not achieved what she hoped it could in the 20s. She was let down by studio films that were formulaic and by art films championed by the Film Society circuit that she felt were lacking in sympathy or storytelling, that weren't complete films for her. She discovered that the really great films were few and far between, and that in a time of global warfare, the 1940s, cinema seemed less important than it had done in its infancy and her youth in peace. In fact, it was because she fell so deeply in love with cinema that she was so profoundly disappointed by it, I think. So this is a quote of hers that I do love, talking about the genuine enthusiasm of a critic for cinema. Nothing in this world was ever well done without a heart being somewhere lost for it. I really, really, really like this quote, not least because I know that the column it comes from, the argument of this column is to debunk the idea that anyone should ever study a film critic. She thinks that's a ridiculous idea. And having put out her stall for just being a passionate fan of the cinema and not a subject for study or conversation at all, she closes this column with a very damning and pithy indictment of Film Society favourite Jean Vigo's Zero de Conduite, which got her into a lot of trouble. People repeated that review against her and were very critical of her. I think John Grierson almost made some kind of connection as to suggest that this kind of negative criticism is what did for Jean Vigo. It was very, very disliked within the art world that she said that. But she'd always been a kind of critic divided. There was a side of her that believed that film was an art, and the side of her that believed that it was a popular entertainment. And she struggled to reconcile them in many different ways. She had a pet story about queuing up for an Alan Nazimova film, and there was in the same queue as her one of her English professors from university and her own cleaning woman. And she sort of loved the idea that cinema brought the two of them together, but with the quotations of female cinema goers that she frequently put inside her columns, it was clear that she thought that cleaning women were better critics. She is no fool, this woman, as she said. And she realised that this divide was inside her. So as early as 1927, she's talking about this conflict, this internal conflict. She writes an open letter to herself in her column. She says, I am afraid, very much afraid, that you neither know nor care anything about art. And I feel that the barrier between us is in little an image of the barrier between the potential and the actual supporters of the screen today, the destruction of it, the only method possible of endowing the vitality of a modern industry with the creative imagination of the ancient arts. Caroline Lejeune wanted film to be an art, and she thought it could be, but she wanted it to remain a popular art form at the same time. She wrestles with this in such interesting and nuanced ways, and I absolutely love the phraseology that she comes up with here, writing about, she's making a decision that only film critics ever have to make when there are two good but very different films out on the same weekend. Forced to choose between Robert Flaherty's Man of Arran, the sort of documentary, Irish documentary, or the original screwball comedy It Happened One Night. She made this call. She said, my official tip for the week is Man of Arran. My unofficial tip is It Happened One Night. I know that this statement will bring down upon me the bitter contempt of film societies, film groups, and film theorists generally, but we all have our weaknesses, and mine happens to be a preference for story over seaweed, however patiently gathered and significantly displayed. She's talking about her own weakness here, and yet this was widely misinterpreted as an attack on Man of Arran, and she had to sort of defend herself by actually bringing more criticism to bear on that film in the letters page of the Guardian because of the Observer, sorry, because she had to back up her opinion that she would rather watch Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. By the time the war starts, she's actually beginning to be wary of critical language entirely. This entire column from 18th of April 1943 is one of my absolute favourites. She talks about a film she loves. She talks about two different war films and she's mildly amusing about them. She makes a great joke about Mickey Rooney and she ends with a review in verse of Escape from Alcatraz, which, yeah, it's a strange column. It shows all her different modes. What she says about the Julien de Vivier film, which she truly, truly loves, is if I were given to hyperbole, which God help me someday I may be, what greater happiness can one conceive than exaggerating in the course of a thing one loves? I should say it was a great film. It was a superb film. It was a prince among films. This being austerity age, I simply suggest that La Fin du Jour is worth a visit. Oh, the way she describes the film following on from that makes you very clear that it's more than worth a visit, that it's clearly a very, very good film indeed. And she's really quite passionate about it. Everything comes to a head in 1947 when she writes this very strange column called Taking the Plunge, in which she writes, well, she says there are no films that are worth talking about that week, and so she's musing on the life of a critic, and she's musing on the fact that most of the things she has to criticize are what she calls bosh. So she says, I am ready to declare categorically that films are not art, and I feel very much the better for it. I'm not entirely sure she felt much better for it, but she did lay her cards on the table. I've chosen a image there from The Gold Rush, not just because it's got a dog in it, and not to criticize Chaplin. She mentions Chaplin. She says that, for example, what Chaplin did was art because he was a great clown, but she says that Chaplin films cannot be art, and I think she just feels that the requirements of art and of labeling something as art are just incompatible with the mass entertainment and the industrial medium that is cinema. To say that this comment was controversial and has been used several times as a sort of stick to beat her reputation with, well, I'm sure you can tell that would have happened. What's interesting, of course, is that she continues reviewing films week in, week out for another 13 years, and she remains an incredibly popular critic. She is writing in The Observer, she's writing in many other she's quoted widely everywhere. She's one of Britain's most popular critics, and yet she's made this stance against art, which understandably, I mean, it makes me wince, and it made a lot of people wince at the time, and we'll talk about that. But I want to talk about the fact that she did continue to love cinema in her own very specific way. In the year 1960, that's when in the summer she storms out of Psycho, and people suggest that she never set foot in the cinema again. That's not true at all. She actually was engaging with some really interesting films in 1960. She really liked Hiroshima Mon Amour. She liked Hiroshima Mon Amour an awful lot, and she called it one of the few films I have ever been tempted to call a work of art. And she actually took a job very briefly with the distributor of that film. I wanted to quote from this review of John Cassavetes' Shadows, not a film that you'd expect a woman in her 60s who was tired of film as art to love. But this is a really beautiful review and it's a very well timed review. I haven't quite got every scrap of paper and every evidence trail in place, but I am pretty certain that by the time she was writing this column, she knew that she was either resigning or being sacked. She says in her memoir that she was sacked, but it's possible that there was something more complicated happening. I think she knows that she's leaving her perch. And this paragraph in her review of Shadows, I think, is incredibly poignant and so simple. The way that she writes is so powerful. She writes like her grandfather, who was a Baptist preacher. I like this film. It makes me feel young again, partly because its strain is human, partly because the new ideas it advances are so refreshingly old. We were looking and hoping this way as far back as 1923. We thought we could find a new world for the cinema by speaking simply and speaking true. We failed. Now perhaps Cassavetes and his kind can find it. I think it's very sad, and I also think it's very generous, and I think it's I'll take anyone who says that Caroline didn't like film that much with a pinch of salt, but I'll never listen to anyone who said that she had a disdain for cinema. I think that's really beautiful. I shouldn't have skipped ahead so far. She resigned by the end of the year. Her Christmas Day column was basically her last column, and she was replaced by a new critic who'd already been writing for The Observer a little bit. And I know for a fact that she continued to engage with cinema because she had a filing cabinet in which she used to keep all her press notes from films and a galley of her own review. And she continued to update that through the 1960s while she's working on many other topics by collating reviews from favourite critics. She really liked the critic from Time magazine in the US, and she would file their reviews away. So we know that she was still engaged with cinema. She briefly worked for this French film distributor, but she also used the opportunity to write other things, like her memoir, like a book about gardening, like finishing an Angela Thirkell novel and doing all kinds of things. But this snippet from a few years after she left The Observer really caught my eye. Kenneth Tynan is probably one of our most famous critics, a dramatic critic and film critic, and this was a very odd thing for him to say at the bottom of one of his stand-in columns, standing in for Penelope Gilliatt. There are more female critics of cinema than of any other art. I sometimes wonder whether the long joint matriarchy of Powell and Lejeune may not have had the unfortunate side effect, unfortunate, he says, of planting deep in the collective unconscious the notion that in order to review films, it is necessary to be womanly. Well, I find this deeply interesting. A few years ago, when I was first researching Caroline Lejeune, or just first beginning taking interest in her, we were very often having the conversation about how there weren't enough female film critics, and the idea that there were too many is hilarious. The Pandora poster is because Kenneth Tynan's argued himself into a little bit of a trap here, and he's taking exception to a male critic criticizing him because that male critic didn't like Band Apart, and neither did Dilys Powell, so he thinks that in somehow there's something dubious about that opinion. But let's not worry too much about Goddard. I thought it'd be interesting to look at the female sphere of criticism in which Lejeune, a famously quite reclusive person, was working, and the female voices that surrounded her and perhaps she inspired. She's not the first female film critic working in the UK. We have to give a lot of credit to Elsie Cohen, who was Dutch, pretty much the same age, worked for a trade magazine, Kinematograph Weekly, and then the fan magazine Pictures and Picturegoer. And she moved into the film business, and she managed and programmed the Academy Cinema, a very art house venue. That's where the Shadows poster comes from, all throughout the 1930s. And C.A. Lejeune, who studied the reviews, and she married someone who had worked at Kinney Weekly, would almost certainly have been well aware of Miss Elsie Cohen and her work. But there were also other women at trade shows, and this is just a weird little detour, but the trade shows were meant to be for the industry only, and the critics were invited to them as well. But they were full, as the Evening News constantly reported, full of women who clearly had no business there, who had no idea where to sit, who were deadheads, as in they weren't part of the film industry. This cartoon in Kinney Weekly explains what may have happened. People who worked in the film business had so many conflicting invites to trade shows, they gave them away to friends, or clearly here it's implied they're social inferiors. So the real people that go to trade shows are not entirely people from the film business, but an office boy, a charwoman, Caroline's favourite, a typist, and a dustman. If you want to read a really beautiful analysis of Caroline's Manchester Guardian columns, Lisa Smith-Stead's book Off to the Pictures really analyses these writings, and she talks a lot about how she quotes all these other women, these working class and lower middle class women who are in the cinema, and sometimes it's quite clear that they are paid screenings, public screenings that she's been to. But I love the idea of the excited Caroline Lejeune going to her first trade show and walking in and discovering that it's full of women talking very loudly about what they think about the pictures, and her earwigging and beginning to think that this conversation is part of the critical conversation for a popular art form. All these people have strong opinions. And in her very famous column called The Women, in the late 20s, when she wrote The Cinema Must Please the Women or Die, she talked about these women, these busy women who took time for the cinema, and said, she is no fool, this woman, no sluggard in criticism. And she means the charwoman and the typist entirely. But that is a detour. The most obvious comparison or peer to Caroline Lejeune is Iris Barry, who's a really fantastic person. A lot of American people, if you're tuned in, will probably know who Iris Barry is. She was part of the Vorticist circle. She was a protege of Ezra Pound, but then she became the Spectator film critic in 1923. So that's a full year after Caroline started her column. The Spectator's a magazine, but it's a national magazine. It's very serious. You might consider her the first serious film critic or the first national film critic, but they're more or less at the same time. They're doing slightly different things. Iris Barry's writing great columns, and then she works for the Daily Mail. She writes prodigiously. As the Daily Mail film critic Henry K. Miller has gone into detail about how much she wrote for them. She was sacked from the Daily Mail because she was rude about an Eleanor Glyn film. She walked out, and Eleanor Glyn had been promised a good review by her editor. She co-founded the Film Society. She was one of that group in 1925. This was a membership organisation that screened artistic, international and hard-to-see films for an invited audience, a membership audience of often quite large-scale people. Caroline Lejeune was invited to be part of this, and she wasn't interested in anything that wasn't to do with the general public, that wasn't for the mass audience, which is where you see she begins to splinter away from the film as art crowd. After Eleanor Glyn ruined her career, Iris Barry moved to New York, and there, many people will know, she founded the film department and the world's first film archive at MoMA. And in this way of looking back and preserving film and evaluating film and literally moving film into the art space, she was able to continue that conversation about film as art, which Caroline just felt wasn't suited to her sphere as a journalist, a working journalist. There are the Pool Group critics and a magazine called Close Up, which was international, published outside of the UK, and called itself the only magazine devoted to film as an art. People like Breyer and Dorothy Richardson, the Stream of Consciousness novelist, wrote for this. Again, they like all the same films that Caroline does, Pabst and Eisenstein and Stroheim, but they are not tied to the release cycles and the film publicity and the industry and all the things that Caroline was so fascinated and distracted by. Dilys Powell spends the 1920s in academia in many ways. And in the Bloomsbury Group, she was an associate and an assistant to Lady Ottoline Morell, so she's part of that set. She did take up her place at Oxford. Caroline turned hers down, and she wrote literary criticism for the Sunday Times for quite a while, and it's sort of quite ladylike and delicate. And then after she gets made the film critic, she rapidly takes on a quite Lejeunean tone. She's witty, she's sharp, she's bracing, she's almost too witty sometimes. She becomes one of Britain's most authoritative film critics very fast, and also a big mover and shaker in the London Film Critics Circle. She stays writing at the Sunday Times until 1979, and then she carries on writing until the 90s. Spielberg credits her with the start of his career, that she championed Duel when other people didn't. She lived long enough to like Tarantino films. She's an absolute dynamo. And she and Caroline are considered to be, for 2 decades, a pair. You see this trade press advert from Val Guest where he singles them out amongst all the critics for giving him a bad review, in fact. And their fellow critic James Agate, who was completely obsessed with Dilys Powell and Caroline Lejeune, I have no more formal way to put it, prints this letter in one of his memoirs where he passes on a message from Caroline to Dilys. Sorry, from Caroline to James. Lejeune said, "You must like Dilys. If you like me, we're halves. I'm all heart, and Dilys is all brain. So bless your dear heart, dear brain." It's a simplification, but in many ways it's true. Caroline was much more interested in sentiment and emotional value than Dilys was. What I would love to do now is to show you a clip from a glittering literary and cinematic event from 1946 at which Dilys Powell and Caroline Lejeune were both invited to speak about the function of criticism.
Notabilities of the film and literary world attended a Foyle's luncheon at which the chairman was Mr. J. Arthur Reck. Film critic Dilys Powell and that other distinguished writer, Mr. James Agate, were the 2 speakers. Stuart Granger and Margaret Lockwood were among the guests of honor to be introduced by Mr. Reck.
Before I ask Miss Powell to speak, I'd like to present to you the guests of honor. We have three here. Miss Margaret Lockwood, Mr. Stuart Granger, and Mr. Lee Golden. Do you allow Mr. Golden? Now I'll ask Miss Powell to speak to you.
Now, what are the qualifications for a critic? I think that members of my profession are often attacked for being too severe. Now, I do think that the very first qualification of a critic is to like the art he's writing about. And if a critic errs on the side of severity, it is not, if he is a sincere and good critic, because he doesn't like what he's writing about. He is severe because he likes it, and because he respects it, and because he expects good things of it.
Following on, Mr. Agate raised plenty of laughs in describing the functions of the critic.
Well, I am a practicing dramatic critic and not a theorist. Mr. Rank produces a picture. That's his job. I say this is a damn good picture, or this picture's awful. That's my job. And there I stop. I know nothing about the function of criticism.
Yes, you will have noticed that Caroline Lejeune didn't speak. She didn't turn up to this event. She wasn't very good at turning up to parties. She really liked to be at home. Although in her defence, she did invite half of Hollywood to her house in Pinner. So she had quite a social life. She just didn't like to go out. So that was a classic Caroline Lejeune appearance because she's not there. But James Agate spoke on her behalf quite thoroughly, I think. Melanie Bell's research tells us that in the post-war British period, 30% of British film critics were women. Now, that's not very many, except it's quite a lot historically, and they became this sort of type and a sort of straw man in the press, and people were talking about the type that is a female film critic or a lady film critic. Sometimes complimentary, as in this larger snippet from the Tatler, but quite often they're considered to be egotistical, emotional, and ridiculous. And generally, there are several comments about how aren't we glad that they write about something unimportant like film and not something more substantial. Just to sort of show you that there's basically a pack of serious male film critics, a sort of smaller pack of female film critics who get tarred with this strange image, and then there's Dilys and Caroline above them all, the most important of everyone. And then there's other people who are incredibly serious. And here's Penelope Houston, who had a most phenomenal career, long like Dilys's. So she's a generation younger. She was at Oxford at Somerville, where everyone seems to go, and she worked on Sequence magazine with Lindsay Anderson and Gavin Lambert. And in that magazine, in 1947, she reviewed Caroline Lejeune's anthology of criticism and was pretty vicious about it. She said criticism on the Lejeune level would reduce all cinema to a mush. She joined Sight and Sound magazine in 1952 and then edited it for an incredible 34 years, from 1956 to 1990. Did remarkable work there. There were lots of female contributors, lots of the women that were working in film criticism, like Margaret Hinksman, Catherine de la Roche, Freddie Bruce Lockhart, wrote for Sight and Sound. She also managed to get someone called Louise Brooks to write for the magazine. Under her editorship, Lindsay Anderson sort of repeated some of these attacks on Caroline Lejeune related to the Observer Film Exhibition, but I think Penelope maybe thought a little bit better of it and was always careful to point out that Caroline Lejeune was important and had a very strong critical voice. But I just think it's important to note that when Caroline left the field and wasn't talking about film as art, there was a whole generation of women following on from her who were able to do so. Something like Sight and Sound didn't exist when Caroline started, although she was the first film critic they ever hired. I haven't got time for that, I'm afraid. And this is Penelope Gilliatt, who's a remarkable figure who deserves 17 lectures all of her own. She is the young woman who replaced Lejeune at the Observer in 1961. She was already covering film festivals for the newspaper. At that point, Caroline didn't want to travel for films. After she was at The Observer, she wrote film criticism at the New Yorker alongside Pauline Kael. She was very much associated with British New Wave cinema, free cinema, John Osborne, The Angry Young Men, and just sort of around about the time that Caroline was very much at the end of her life, there she was writing the screenplay for Sunday Bloody Sunday. She went on, she had her own scandals about her own criticism, but very much a new generation of female voice that follows on from Caroline Lejeune, who first carved out this space and spoke with her full heart and collaborated with the cinema in the way that she really thought was important. When she died on the 31st of March 1973, her son was still fighting her battles for a railing in the Daily Mail against Last Tango in Paris, while Dilys Powell was enjoying that film very much. But she was remembered incredibly fondly for her wit and her good sense, and still because she was the woman who encouraged Britain to take cinema seriously. I need to do a quick commercial break here. If you want to know more about British film critics, and of course you do, this book, Film Critics and British Film Culture, has a chapter by me on Lejeune. It has a fantastic chapter by Laura Main on Dilys Powell, Melanie Self on the sort of cultural value of film critics at the time. This book, accompanying a touring retrospective of post-war British cinema, has a chapter by me on women in British film, and also from a former editor of Sight and Sound on British film critics, which repeats a lot of these attacks on C.A. Lejeune. So the argument is still out there, and you can pick your side. And if you want to know more about the absolutely very good biography by Robert Sitton, but there's a half-hour Radio 4 documentary next month that I narrated that I think you really might like to listen in for. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to leave you with a poster from one of Caroline's favourite films and a very smart quote. There is a double pleasure in watching a good film and knowing why it is good. As Caroline would say, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Pamela. That was so fantastic. I really learned a lot, and I had some questions that you answered at the end there. So I was going to say, I just really want to read more of her criticism. And is there a good source or good, her and Dilys Powell are both, that's the one.
So there is the C.A. Lejeune film reader, and there's a Dilys Powell film reader, which is also on my shelf. Excellent. These you should be able to find. Caroline has another anthology that she called Chestnuts in Her Lap, which is quite a strange title. And you actually can see some of her stuff reprinted online quite often. And we need more of it because her columns were all great. Both of them wrote so well. And it's a joy to have these sort of strong female voices.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll be not on Amazon, but I'll be out on greenapplebooks.com shortly to order up. Anyway, so the floor is open for questions. I see the chat is filling up with commendations and thanks and thumbs ups and claps and all that sort of thing. I don't see any questions in there or even comments people want to share.
Oh, well, I don't know. What shall I should tell you that one of the things to know about Caroline is that she was from Manchester. She studied in Manchester. She loved Manchester. She was thoroughly associated. So she spent her entire life in exile in London. Despite the fact that everyone sounds like they're from London, she was very much a daughter of Manchester. What else? I have so many things I could tell. I just thought there'd be questions. I have so many bits of information for people about.
You are a cornucopia of information. What's your favorite fun fact or trivia tidbit that maybe you didn't throw into the presentation, or a favorite quote or something like that?
I like the beginning of that column when she wants to recommend La Fin du Jour, and she wants to, against herself, talk about something that she really seriously, passionately feels is art. And she just starts the column by something like, fans of Mickey Rooney will find nothing for them this week in the cinema. And she was very fond of writing her columns in verse, which I definitely definitely don't really appreciate. But when she did it in short couplets, they were very funny, and I should try to share some of those on Blue Sky. Someone's asking me about Powell and Pressburger, and I can certainly answer this question.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I was going to say we have
So,
two questions, both about
Caroline was a huge fan of Michael Powell and a huge fan of Brink Pressburger, as well as of their films together. She bigged up Michael Powell at the very beginning of his quote a quickie career when people weren't noticing, and she said that he was doing better films than Hitchcock and Asquith, which is important when you realize she was friends with Hitchcock and remained so. She champions Emmerich Pressburger when he's a screenwriter not working with Powell. A weird thing happens when she's talking about the sort of wartime Powell and Pressburger films. She suddenly starts talking about them only as Powell films, including, she reviews A Canterbury Tale. She says, Michael Powell, the screenwriter, has given Michael Powell, the director, a problem, or something like that. And only after her husband stops working for Alexander Korda does she start talking about them as Powell and Pressburger again. So for British film aficionados, that might seem like some really hot tea. But yeah, no, she really, really liked that film. She wrote beautifully about the Red Shoes, reviewed it everywhere, except like most critics, she thought the ending was far, far too violent.
Okay. We have some.
Hind is asking what is Lejeune's favourite film genre? Oh, there we go. Oh, and we have the byline question. Lejeune likes all kinds of genres. She liked melodrama. She liked thrillers. She liked quite violent films. Favorite actors? I mean, she did love Alina Azamova desperately, and she was very good friends with Robert Donat as well. The byline thing is really interesting. She had to change her name when she went to the Observer. I think at least she wanted to be more of a public figure. They had allowed surnames. The Manchester Guardian didn't, but the editor of the Manchester Guardian didn't want her to use the same name at the newspaper that she had done at the Manchester Guardian, and he didn't want her to use C, A, or L at all. He thought that belonged to him, so she had to fight to keep it. Absolutely.
Oh. So we have a couple questions about Peeping Tom. So her reaction, or did she actually weigh in aside from stomping out of the screening?
Oh yeah, she absolutely. She wrote that she wasn't going to watch it. She wrote that it was horrible and sordid and just vile. She was, you know, in her 60s at the time and of maybe a generation. But I mean, that film's incredibly provocative, I think, and it's very critical of journalists and of the film industry and of the whole Soho world. I think it's impossible that she would have liked it. What happened with Peeping Tom is that she didn't like it, and then basically none of the other critics liked it, and it has been remembered that they were all following her, which in a way is very flattering to her, but I think actually they all genuinely found it quite upsetting. If anyone has seen Peeping Tom recently, it was obviously a great film, but it's very upsetting, and I think that particularly the scenes that involved the child would have been very upsetting to her. She was very sentimental about children. She loved her son. You don't. Some people are writing some very long comments now.
So okay, so I'll pluck one off here from Maggie, who comments and asks, I was fascinated by the anecdote about what happened. It happened one night versus Man of Iran, especially her jab at film theorists. Were there other anecdotes or instances when she critically positioned herself between the popular and the academic?
I mean, absolutely. I think because she was clued into those sort of circuits, so she knew what people were recommending and she knew what was considered the right thing. And so when she's so vicious about Zero de Conduite, it's interesting that, you know, it gets used against her. Where the public screening of that film, they read out her review and they say 0 for Lejeune and 0 for The Observer, and they're very angry. Of course, she probably gives them more publicity, but then when someone else fills in for her years later, when the film is reissued, they just repeat Caroline's thing as if that's the official Observer line on this now. She could sometimes position herself between the popular and the academic in that way, in a way that was a bit nauseating. When she writes for the Observer Film Exhibition, she talks about being a little girl who went to see little films, and film is just fun. And I think that kind of really wound up the Film Society Brigade. And she meant it, but she could also write about it in a different register as well.
Okay. All right, if we are probably winding down time, but we have a couple questions that I think we can get to. One was what I said. Oh, one, I think actually you to interject a little bit. It was like, that was really, where'd it go? Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry. Could you talk a little bit about how researching the history of female film critics informs your own practice as a film critic?
I mean, okay, can we just say for one thing that you can imagine a very, very high cliff that Caroline Lejeune is at the top of. I'm somewhere deep underground in the bottom of a mine. Like, so I don't compare myself to her at all. But it's very interesting that you think about the way your voice is. When I started my website, I thought it was obvious that I was a woman, and F1 wrote to me as if I was a man. And Caroline Lejeune, she talks about critics as if they're men and cinema goers as if they're women. And yet she has this CAL byline. So so I had that kind of anonymity thing. And it's interesting to watch how she responds to criticism and when she chooses not to, because I tend to just think, you know, if someone disagrees with you, let it go. And she has a way of choosing which battles to fight. It gets to the point where her son Anthony Lejeune apparently is going on the radio to argue with Lindsay Anderson, and that perhaps isn't great. But I think the way that she writes in what is clearly a feminine tone and on the side of the feminine aspect of the audience is really inspirational to me, because she doesn't feel like even though she feels like she has to mimic in the basic ways of using this format for her byline, she doesn't feel like she has to sound like any male critic. She's very clearly using a woman's voice, and that's interesting to me, because I think, you know, some of the magazines that I write for are considered to be a little bit harsh about films, and you know, it is a serious tone that one is meant to adopt. But Caroline Lejeune, more than 100 years ago, is saying you can be serious and incredibly feminine at the same time. So that's interesting. But also, I mean, I'm just thinking about how the concept of a female film critic really tended to get under people's skin quite a lot, and looking at it from a distance. But I'll never be as good a film critic as Caroline Lejeune, but I do get to quote her in presentations on the internet, so that's good.
Well, that I think is the perfect wrap up for this conversation. We have a couple of questions that unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to, but what a fantastic presentation. I mean, the fact that we're still queuing up questions just shows, you know, that the interest out there, and for you, it was worth stay up until midnight to do this. We thank you so much for that. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you. And I think people are clapping online, and thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, as Caroline would say. And I hope that everyone is looking into their favorite film critics too, because we all do it sometimes. We always say the critics thought this or the critics thought that, but they're all individual bunch of weirdos, aren't they? So, and that's what I know. That's what I know. So thank you so much for listening to me talk about Caroline.
All right. Thank you. Okay. And so thank you all for joining us today. To keep up with the San Francisco Film Preserve, please follow us on your social media. We are at SF Film Preserve, as you might expect. And if you're not already, I very much encourage you to sign up for our newsletter at filmpreserve.org and share it with your friends. We promise not to spam, and we never share our mailing list. And I'd like to remind you Bay Area residents especially, of our upcoming special screening at the Roxy Theater on Tuesday, August 26th, where we present the world premieres of two of our newest restorations, Black Lightning, starring Clara Bow, and Thunder the Marvel Dog, and the short adventure, The Love Fighter, starring Fearless the Wonder Dog. Both films will be accompanied live by the incredibly talented Wayne Barker, no pun intended, and introduced by writer, historian, and author David Sten. Tickets at roxy.com or our own website, filmpreserve.org. The next installment of Online with SFFP takes place on Friday, September 19th, with Sophia Loren of George Eastman Museum and Masha Matzke, film restorer at Georgia Kinematheek, explore and present a history of American artist and animator Douglas Crockwell, his Mutoscope-related work, past transfer efforts, and their project to digitize and preserve his works. You can learn more and register for this event by visiting filmpreserve.org. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you at the movies.